Charlotta, please.
Yes, as you said, I'm from the political science department at Luleå University of Technology, and maybe I can shed some lights, because sometimes you wonder, why is policy moving so slowly? I mean, if we see all these huge challenges, why are policy moving so slowly? And hopefully today I will going to give you a few pinpoints of why that can actually be. Why am I here? I'm a political scientist, and why do we worry about bioenergy? Well, as part of my research, I've looked at how we address environmental issues within bioenergy policy. So that is why I've also stepped upon these conflicts that come up on the policy level. And today I'm going to talk about the rising policy conflicts on the way towards a European bioeconomy. And I will do that looking at obstacles, possibilities on the way towards a European bioeconomy from an environmental policy integration perspective and from a multi-level governance perspective. And I'm sure it's going to come clear why I'm doing that. I'm going to do this presentation in 3 steps. Because to understand these rising policy conflicts, we need to understand sort of first of the basic elements of the conflict, and then the more specific elements of the conflict, and then as a third step, can these conflicts be overcome? Are there any hope? And if so, how? So first of all, the basic sort of traits of the conflicts has to do with what we mean by sustainability. Because as you know, environmental problems, they are a bit special compared to other types of policy problems that we deal with every day. First of all, you see those chimneys over there. Environmental problems are usually transnational, and they travel across borders. We can't put up fences to stop pollution from coming across borders. That is very difficult. We can't put up fences to stop CO2 emissions either. So these problems are very often transnational, and at the same time they're often multi-sectoral. In order to solve them, we have to involve many different policy sectors. So that is one of the basic elements of environmental issues. The other one is the middle pictures, because the problems are very often global, while the solutions are local. And you may have heard the slogan, "The private is political." That is originally from the feminist movement, talking about the private area, private sectors, the family, and so on, and that we had to make these political and actually address them politically. In the environmental issues, that is the same thing. We make rational individuals' decisions every day. You know, on a rainy day like this, it's perfectly rational to take the car instead of putting yourself on a bike and get wet while you're on your way to work. And as nations, we also make these rational individual decisions. I mean, we want to promote our industries and so on. We want to have coal industries because they promote, or steel industries because they make sure that we have jobs in our nations. But all these rational individuals' decisions lead to suboptimal collective outcomes. That is, we don't have a sustainable society. So, in order to solve these problems, we go to the third picture. We require international, cross-level, and also cross-sector cooperation because of the sort of basic elements of environmental problems. And this, you may recognize, this was recognized already in 1987 by the Brundtland Commission, who stated that there is this mismatch between how we sort of organize the political society and these problems that we are facing in the environmental area. So what they said basically was that these real worlds of interlocked economic and ecological systems will not change, and instead we have to change our policies and institutions. And that is how we sort of started talking about sustainable development and how we can actually address these issues. But, as you all may also know, this sustainability concept contains 3 dimensions. And that was one reason for why the politicians could actually agree on this concept. But it's also causing a bit of problems. First of all, the economic dimension, promoting growth and production, aid, development, and so on. We have the social dimension, promoting poverty, gender equality, health, and participation. And then we have the ecologic dimension, looking at more of ecosystem protection, ecological resilience. And as we're going to see, then sustainability becomes a bit more difficult to achieve. Because when we are trying to solve these three and get towards a sustainable society, we are inevitably going to be running into goal conflicts. That is just how it is. And how we are actually going to look at these goal conflicts and how they should be solved depends on how we look at the world. And we all have different outlooks there. Either we take an anthropocentric worldview, that is, we put the humans in the center of everything, and we weigh everything else on the planet towards human needs. That is one way of looking at society, saying that nature has no value unless it's valuable to us as humans, unless we need it in some way. The other sort of extreme position would say to take an ecocentric worldview and say, nature has an intrinsic value, and it's valued no matter what it means to us as humans. And some ecocentrists will say, okay, but who speaks, like the Oneida Indians used to say in their meetings every day, they said, who speaks for the wolves in this meeting? And I mean, some of them would actually, some ecocentrists would say, who speaks for nature in our political discussions these days? Usually we take the sort of in-between position, looking at the, human beings are as part of the sort of the natural world, and we are sort of finding a balance between human interest and nature's interest. But one way we have tried to actually solve these sort of conflicts and making sure that politicians take environment into account in their daily decisions is the principle of environmental policy integration, which is part of the EU Lisbon Treaty, and it has been part of the Amsterdam Treaty as well. So it's a basic element of policy discussions that we should take environmental issues into account in all policy sectors, just like we're making sort of economic calculations of our policy decisions. And when we look at bioenergy from a sort of environmental policy integration lens, there's going to be some important insights that we can learn from. So if we move forward, what do we mean by a sustainable bioeconomy then, now that we know that there are sort of inherent goal conflicts in the sustainability concepts? Well, first of all, bioeconomy requires bioenergy. And bioenergy is a multi-sector process, since it's produced from biofuels and derived from biomass, and that is produced in many different sectors, forestry, agriculture, and different waste streams, and also from field fuels and so on. But it's at the same time a multi-level process, because, I mean, it's of increasing importance in order to achieve this 27% renewable energy by 2030 goal, and to get more transport fuels made from renewable sources. At the same time, any future bioenergy expansion within the EU depends on both the demand side, and that has to do with energy policy and climate change policy, but also the supply side, that has to do with agriculture, forestry, waste policies. And all of these sort of go together. How do these develop? And it also depends on policies on both the global level, the EU level, the national level, and the subnational levels. And all of these have to sort of agree in order to make sure that we are getting somewhere. So, what conflicts do we see emerging? Well, as Mika showed you these graphs, we have a prognosis from the UN that in 2050 we are supposed to be 10.6 billion people on the planet. So a 51% world population growth, which will probably cause a 91% increase in the demand for transportation fuels. And at the same time, we are discussing the climate change emissions and how we are going to sort that out. And we have concerns regarding energy security. That is, we are importing a lot of energy, fossil energy, from maybe more or less democratic states. And together, this has spurred the interest in bioenergy globally, but also within the European Union. And biofuels currently constitute 70% of the renewable energy consumption. Although that consumption should be steady, it's pretty small compared to the whole consumption. So there are a big sort of conflict going on, and we have agriculture and forest production systems which has to feed and shelter a growing world population and meet the demands for fuel, fiber, fertilizer, and all these other types of goods and services. So that are the sort of basics of the conflict. And at the same time, we see that politicians, even within the European Union, in the different policy sectors that are relevant for bioenergy, have different views on the potential benefits for large-scale bioenergy production. There are worries about the future competition of forest biomass. We also know that there are potential environmental, socio-economic benefits. I'm going to show you some. But do they outweigh the risks or unintended consequences if we increase bioenergy use? How can we accommodate the EU policy goal of increasing biodiversity protection with an increased forest use? That is difficult. And at the same time, the focus is very different, as I said, in the different sectors that are affecting bioenergy. So forestry, agriculture, energy and transport all have different focus, even within the European Union. And this is sort of what it looks like when you start to look at the different frames, how we sort of frame bioenergy in different policy sectors. And from these are sort of views on bioenergy that are forwarded in EU policy documents. One way of promoting is saying, but we need it for green growth. We need bioenergy in order to make sure that we have growth, but it's greener. One way of looking at it is saying, but we need domestic energy. So in order to decrease import needs, we need to have domestic energy sources, and bioenergy is one of those. Another way is saying, okay, but we need rural development, both within the European Union, but also in the developing world, and that is one way of addressing it through bioenergy. And another frame is for climate change, in order to reduce climate. But at the same time, we have other types of issues going on. So what's going to happen with the pricing of wood, as I said? What's going to happen if we start importing bioenergy from developing countries, which should actually produce food for their growing population instead of producing energy for Western vehicles? What's going to happen with the recreational values if we start using much more forest for bioenergy production? I mean, we Nordics, we appreciate our forests a lot. Are we prepared to actually have less forests to walk in at our spare time? And regarding climate change, what's going to happen with forests as carbon sinks? They are a way of actually reducing carbon and taking up carbon dioxide. So, I mean, there are lots of things. And at the same time, we have EU targets for biodiversity, as I said. And what's going to happen? Yes, as Mika mentioned, the agriculture sector currently at least have a lot of fossil fuels going on. And as well do the forestry sector. Will they be able to produce their own biofuels in order to make this sustainable? Or, I mean, initially at least there's going to be an increase in GHG emissions, probably, from an increased bioenergy production. So there are lots of conflicts going on. So if you sum up, EU bioenergy policy can counteract EU targets regarding biodiversity, land use change, and climate change mitigation. So there has to be some priorities made here. What are we going to prioritize? And there we have not agreed yet. And of course, that is one explanation for why things are moving a bit slowly, maybe. However, there are some potential synergies as well between bioenergy and nature conservation. If we use more forest residues, there's going to be less fire risks. We can have a more open landscape if we have more grass cuttings and so on. But we have to solve the impact on wood prices. The wood industry is worried that there's going to be the impact of wood prices. And are there going to be import needs? We also have to look at forest plantation for biomass versus forest as carbon sinks, and deforestation or biodiversity. What are we going to prioritize there? And we have to make the social sort of weighing of exploiting poor regions to produce cheap biofuels for the rich, if you go to extreme argumentation, or should we look at it as beneficial for poor regions? Can we find a win-win situation here? So, thirdly and finally, can we actually overcome these conflicts? And if so, how? Well, I can say that there are some positive and some negative or pessimistic aspects. The optimism is that you can say that some of these conflicts are based in more what we label as policy disagreements. And this means that we have different scientific understandings of the environmental consequences and outcomes of bioenergy production. And this is actually good, because that would actually make sure that we discuss these things. And through discussions, we will produce new knowledge, and we will have new light shed on environmental consequences of bioenergy. And one example of this is that we actually, a few years ago, got the sustainability criteria for biofuels. And I actually heard, I missed the morning session yesterday, but I think that somebody said that there are going to be some biomass sustainability criteria soon as well. That has been such a difficult process, I can tell you. So we're going to see if that is actually going to happen. So there is some optimism. On the other hand, there is also some evidence when we look at the debate around bioenergy, which are more pessimistic. I mean, there are some fundamental conflicting values here, which we label as policy controversy. And these are really difficult to reconcile. And this has to do with the basic views on what values are prioritized in societal development. How can we share rights and responsibilities in a global world? And these are less likely to be reconciled, I could say. But of course, there is a possibility that we can. But this demands heavy political discussions. If we look at sort of what can we do then as politicians on different levels in order to reach a European bioeconomy then? Is it even possible? Are there some hope? Well, we have looked at what spurs renewable energy development at the subnational level. And one way is, one thing that is really important is the environmental agenda setting. Here the EU and national level has a really important role to play in order to define what is sustainable, to come with sustainability criteria and to help local actors who are waiting for being able to invest in new renewable energy sources. They want to know what is to be viewed as sustainable in the long term. They can't just, it can't be like that. The one day in Sweden, ethanol is really good for the environment, and then the next day everybody is saying, no, we don't want that anymore. I mean, you have to have long-term determined politicians saying this is going to be sustainable, and that's going to happen, and that's going to be for a long time. The second step is to have project research funding available from the EU and national level. That is really important in order to be able to make the investment to start up new technology developments. And we have to find win-win strategies. Because for municipalities, let's face it, it's not environment in the first place. It is local job creation, it's local growth. And that is the main driving forces for municipalities to want to invest. But of course, environmental arguments will start to matter if it comes clear signals from the higher up that environment is actually going to be emphasized here. And if you want to receive these funds that the EU or the national level is putting up, then people have to be competent to actually apply for it. And this, when we look at cases as a national and regional level, sometimes that is actually really difficult for municipalities and for county administrations to build up this competence to be able to actually apply and get and receive EU funding. And one thing that is really important as well, get policy entrepreneurs going. These are really important in order to connect actors, to find win-win solution, and to actually be able to balance renewable energy projects and get the buzzwords going in order to receive EU funding. So that you get in line with the global debate, EU and national funding opportunities, and frame this in terms of local needs as well. What's also important to remember is that the subnational level is actually the level that holds the key to the realization of sustainability ambitions. As I said, the private is political, and these trade-offs are made on the local level. The real trade-offs are made here, and this is where biomass is actually produced. So we need the local level. And when we look at what drives these issues, we should not underestimate the role of the environment. Because what we see is that if we get renewable energy projects initiated on environmental grounds, they're actually more durable than renewable energy projects which are initiated for other reasons. Let's say to get supply security or economic growth. And this is actually, that holds also for Swedish development. If you look at bioenergy policy over the last 30 years, when we made investment in Sweden in bioenergy policy based on environmental arguments, we actually lasted longer than we did when we just wanted to replace oil because the oil prices were really high at one time in the beginning, in the mid-70s. When we have environmentally interested persons in leading positions, they tend to enter renewable energy projects with much more realistic expectations and also endure longer within projects. Because if they expect explosive growth in jobs, you're probably going to get disappointed after a while. You have to be a bit more, like have a vision of a sustainable, long-term sustainable region or similar in order to make sure that municipalities actually stay in these renewable energy projects. But remember also that there are high-level political priorities that provide the setting and that will guide the subnational actors in their actions. But at the same time, you have to be able to make the win-win arguments to win over the subnational actors, because they also have to make the trade-offs in investing in healthcare, education, and I mean they have a very limited budget. So you have to make sure, I mean, as I said, environment is not going to be their top priority. So if you can find win-win solutions, you're going to get a much easier way of investing in renewable energy projects. So to summarize, what can we do to handle these policy conflicts that we see are rising on the global level? Well, on the global EU or higher levels, national levels, we need priorities. They are necessary, absolutely necessary. If we don't resolve these types of policy conflicts, if it is between economy and environment, or if it's between environment and environment, as we actually see, it's not only economy difficulties, it's also between biodiversity and climate change. We have to make these trade-offs higher up so that we can guide the subnational actors on how they are supposed to handle these. Policies on higher levels also need to be clear and consistent. Because if you get long-term, high-level policy signals, that's going to spur subnational development. And money talks. So if you want action to go on in the subnational level, you have to follow strategies up with economic instruments as well. On the subnational level, you have to find the win-win strategies and get long-term commitment, but please on realistic grounds. Do not promise explosive growth in jobs, because then the municipalities will leave as soon as they see that that is not going to happen in 1 year or two. You also have to build competence for EU national funding applications and to build regional networks, long-term networks, and get some firebrands that can actually keep these networks going together. If you want to read more about this, you can look at some of these papers. And basically, what this is all about is to sort of maintain these types of landscapes in the Nordic countries, also in the future. So hopefully some of these conflicts can actually be reconciled. Thank you.
Very much. Yeah, we should probably leave that one of your last slides there about the solutions on as we move on after the coffee to the next step here, where we're going to look at and hear more about what the regions are doing and could do more to solve this. But yes, again, this is a very complex issue. Anyone who has a question or comment right now, do you agree with this picture? Yes.
Thank you, Mats Eklund, Linköping University. I think that one of the conflicts you are not saying so much about, which I think is very interesting, is that we have just sort of accepted this food fuel situation, and to me, it's a very interesting to see how that has become so powerful, so that other principles of that landowners should be able to use their land for whatever best for them to create the highest value, and based on that they could actually get more money and buy the food. So why is this even possible? Because I think, is it just because it's an emotional issue among everyone, or how can we actually challenge that very fundamental view on that landowners should be allowed to use their land the way they want?
Thank you. Very good question.
Okay, I'm not sure I will be able to answer that. I mean, that is one of those policy controversials that we have to deal with. I mean, that is one of those issues that is really difficult to solve. I mean, and I think the only way of solving is to make real political priorities. I mean, to have sustainability criteria, for example, for biofuels and so on. That is one way forward. But that is a sort of fundamental conflict. Like, how are we going to view how are we viewing the right of the landowners towards the need for food in developing countries? But one way forward also is what Mika mentioned. I mean, to use waste products instead of using like fresh food products. So if we are able to move towards finding waste products of different types. There are lots of waste products in agriculture, for example, which could be used to produce biogas or things like that. So that is one way to find the waste products instead of using food. Would be one way.
And then you have the algae and the
yes.
oceans. And
yes. The oceans.
So yes, one more question. Sorry, over there.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Mike Laho from Volter, Finland. We develop biomass CHP solutions on the small scale. And thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's very relevant, especially for our field. Being in the biomass space, we benefit from this multifaceted approach with this policy, especially. Much of our customers are abroad from the Finnish perspective. And I think these are very relevant issues. I just had one question regarding the forestry. You had mentioned that the forest resources are, on the one hand, positive for supplying the fuel for the biomass and bioenergy solutions, but on the other hand, the forest also serves as a emissions sink, so to speak. But what I wanted to pose is a question that I think the Nordic area understands this aspect as they have intensive forestry management methods and very innovative and a long history behind that. But isn't it just a know-how issue that spreading this forest management policies, is it more that kind of an issue rather than this problem that we would be eliminating this carbon sink?
Thank you. A very good point. I think actually the conflict is more on the sort of EU level. I think in the Nordic countries we know how to manage. We have management schemes for forestry and so on. But I think on the EU level there has been discussions and opponents of using forest as biofuels because they want some interest wants the forest to stay there as carbon sinks. So that is basically what I mean. But of course there are ways of coming past these issues and handle it
more
sustainably.
Nordic know-how to the EU. Again, we have the solutions here and we'll promote them further, and I know you all will. Thank you very much. We're actually running a bit behind schedule because we have such interesting speakers and lots of questions, which is all great. Although I wanted you to get a cup of coffee and maybe something sweet as well before we start the next session, where we will hear from a number of researchers who have focused even more on the regional level actors and their role and what they're doing and what they could do more. But also before I leave you for the coffee, I wanted to again just encourage you to use Twitter, Nordic Green hashtag, with questions, comments, reflections on this as we move along. But anyway, thank you again, Charlotta, for that intervention. And now coffee